Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming for today's book talk. I'm Suzanne Wunz. I'm the Executive Director of the Law School Library here, and am very pleased to have with us and to hear more from our Professor Lani Guinier talking about her new book, The Tyranny of the Meritocracy, Democratizing Higher Education in America. So we're going to do, Lani's going to give us a brief talk, and then we'll do a lot of questions and answers. So we'll look forward to that conversation. I would like to mention that it's being taped, so the question and answers will be part of the recording. So just keep that in mind when you're asking your questions. And on that note, I'll just introduce Professor Guinier is the Bennett Vosky Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. She's the author of many scholarly articles and books, a few of which are The Tyranny of the Majority, Becoming Gentlemen, Women Law School and Institutional Change, Lift Every Voice, Turning a Civil Rights Setback into a New Vision of Social Justice, and The Miner's Canary, Enlisting Race, Resisting Power, and Transforming Democracy. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Guinier. Thank you.
So it's a pleasure to be here, even though the weather makes it less pleasurable. I got involved in this question of meritocracy, in part when I was applying to Harvard in 1966, a long time ago, in other words. And I wrote a letter to the SAT after I had taken it because I was critical of the way in which they presented two math problems. I never heard back from them, by the way. And I did get into Harvard, but at the time it was called Radcliffe because I was a woman. But I have to say that my concern about how we admit people and on what basis do we admit people actually had its earlier growth when I learned from my father about his own experiences at Harvard College. So my father was an immigrant from the Caribbean. He had become a citizen. He was at Boston English High School. He did very well. He was admitted to Harvard. All of that worked until they saw him. He showed up on the first day of class, and they were appalled. What's this black man doing here? And when he gave them the information that said, well, he had been admitted, they said, oh. They probably said more than oh, but it was, maybe it was, oh my God. And part of the reason they were upset is that Harvard at the time had an admissions policy that they could only admit one black person a year. And they'd already admitted that person, and then my father showed up, who had also already been admitted, but he had been admitted by letter, not by photograph. So for him, it was Harvard was not a very comforting or exhilarating experience because he wasn't allowed to live in the dormitories. He joined with some of the other blacks in the neighborhood, one of whom was the first person and for a long time the only person to even greet him, and that was Ralph Bunche, who was a graduate student at the time. So with that history in mind, I'm telling you that in part to explain why I thought the SAT was such a significant moment in one's life until I took the SAT and then decided that the SAT was not, at least from my perspective, predictive of what I was going to do or, in fact, a summary of what I had already done. So fast forward, I had applied in 1967 to 3 schools. I got into Radcliffe, which was the women's school of Harvard, and my father was just exhilarated, so much so that he left whatever he was doing when the envelope came in and ran to my high school, which had 6,000 students in it, so he had to try and find me. And so he was very proud, and he figured that I would actually not only get admitted, but in fact I'd stay, because he had to leave during the middle of the Depression, since he didn't have enough money. And we don't have to go on about his biography, but I'm just trying to locate for you where I'm coming from in terms of my focus on access to higher education. I also got involved in this issue when I was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where I went, having spent most of my career up until then as a practicing lawyer with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And that job was really, I'd say, one, if not the only, or the most only, favorite experience. But I got an offer to teach at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and that turned out to be a challenging but also very rewarding experience. And one of the reasons it was so rewarding is that the students, unlike students in some other law schools, felt comfortable going up and speaking to law professors, knocking on your door and playing out several of your creative ideas in my office. And when I was at Penn, a group of women wanted to do a course on gender. I told them at that time I really hadn't been studying gender, but I knew something about race. So they said, oh, okay, they'll do one on race and gender. That was fine. But at the same time, another woman came up to me and said that she wanted to talk because she didn't like being one of the characters on a game that they called Asshole Bingo. And I don't know if you play Asshole Bingo here at Harvard, but they apparently played it at Penn. And what is the game? You predict who's going to talk in class, and you predict it on a crossword puzzle, or in the type of a crossword puzzle. And if you get 2 in a row, meaning you raise your hand when somebody is asking a question, and if you know they're going on and on, they become somebody in your tic-tac-toe board. And if you get 2 in a row, you raise your hand and you ask a question, but you use certain triggers like asshole bingo, or the men on the game were assholes and the women were feminazi dykes. That was the other language that they were using. Anyway, I got involved in a study about women at law school, and as a result of that study, and as a result of the fact that we had a new dean, who then gave me data from 4 years of student admission to the school, meaning I got their SATs, their LSATs, their undergraduate GPA, and then how well did they do in law school. And we found out, we meaning a group of people who actually knew how to do a lot more statistics than I did, we found out that the LSAT was a terrible predictor of performance. It explained 14% of the variance first year, did a little better second year, 15% of the variance, meaning that most of the time they had no clue how somebody who took the LSAT was going to do. So that I'm saying because that's another reason that I'm interested in these questions. And I guess the third reason goes back to this question about the students who wanted to do a seminar on issues of gender. And they, in part, were influenced by the study that I had done with several other women. And they wanted to do a seminar in which the issues surrounding women would be addressed more directly. And I said, and as I said earlier, that's fine as long as we also link that to race, because I know something about race. I haven't really studied issues of gender. But the key thing about that seminar was that the women in the class, and then they also recruited men, facilitated the class themselves. I mean, because this was their idea, this was something that they were committed to, and it was such an enjoyable experience for the students as well as for me that I ended up doing this seminar for the next 6 years while I was at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. And more people started wanting to take this seminar because they felt that it was a place that they could be honest, but it was also a place where they could really learn because they weren't intimidated. So I say all of that as the prelude to the Tyranny of the Meritocracy book, because the introduction of the book is based on an experience that my son had when he was at Cambridge Ringe, the high school here in Cambridge, and had been involved. He was taking physics, and there was a student in the class who was the son of a police officer. This is a white male, and he didn't do very well on the SAT. And there was another white male in this very small physics class who was boasting about how well he did on the SAT. And so there was this sense of bereavement on one side and extraordinary self-imaging and pride on the other. Now, so that's the introduction. Coming to Harvard Law School, and also when I was at Penn, based on the experience I had where the women approached me, wanted to do a course, ended up facilitating the course, ended up really enjoying the course, and ended up in several cases becoming law professors, that I also tried doing the same thing at Harvard, that is teaching a class where the students are actually leading the class. I meet with them and I talk to them about the various issues that they want to discuss, but they assume leadership in the class. And that sense of I don't want to say power because it's not that they were overwhelming people, but that sense of self, that sense of capacity, that sense of pride, and that sense of learning made the experience of working together in a group very, very powerful and in many ways redirecting people's attention to what they wanted to do ultimately in their life after law school. I also have been the beneficiary of a group of people at Harvard University where they bring together professors from multiple domains and have each of us teach a group of other faculty members throughout the university something that we would be teaching from the courses that we work on. And that experience has also been very powerful, and I just want to give you a couple of examples, and then I'm really most interested in your questions and then also your answers. So the person about whom I'm speaking is Eric Mazur. He's a professor of physics, and he noticed he had been trying all kinds of lesson plans and hadn't really hit on one that he found the most rewarding. But he also noticed that the women were not doing as well as the men in physics. And when he talked to his colleagues about that, they said, well, there's something wrong with the women, or women aren't supposed to do physics. But he was committed. And so he came up with a means of involving everybody, and that is requiring that people a day in advance of class or 2 days in advance had to ask questions that they didn't feel they felt comfortable answering. And he would then go through that, take a few of those questions, put them up for the students individually to answer the questions. And then after they had answered the questions, they were to speak to their neighbor to talk about, well, what were your answers, and to see if your answers were similar to mine. And it was in that process of talking to your colleague, the person sitting next to you, and learning from them and teaching them, demonstrated a very different approach to pedagogy. And it was actually a very good approach, because the women in this interaction started to be more engaged in the class, and their scores on the class exams went way up. Same thing with a group of black students in calculus. This was not at Harvard, this was at Berkeley, where a young professor, Uri Treisman, discovered that the black students were not doing particularly well in calculus, and the Chinese American students were doing fabulously well. And he went to his colleagues, why is there this difference? And they came up with all of the predictable explanations. Oh, they're not studying. They came from high schools that weren't as good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what Uri Treisman did was he hired people to video the Chinese American students when they were studying for calculus. And he found that they were talking to each other and problem solving with each other, and they were doing so not just in the class, but on their way to the class, when they were having lunch, when they were studying, and that in many ways that helped explain why they were doing so well, is that they were teaching each other. They weren't just competing with each other. So he designed a course and invited the black students in his calculus class to do something very similar to what the Chinese American students were doing, and that is to create essentially a posse, a group of people that are studying the same kinds of questions, but this, instead of competing individually, you get to work together to try to solve these problems. And as with the women in physics, the black students in calculus started doing much better because of this collaborative approach. So why am I committed to collaboration since I don't teach physics? In fact, never took physics. I did take some version of calculus, but it was in high school. I couldn't tell you a thing about it now. And what is it is the opportunity to rethink merit, and that's the explanation for the book title, The Tyranny of the Meritocracy. We tend to think of merit as competitive individualism, and that people compete against each other to demonstrate that they're more meritorious than someone else, and because they're more meritorious, they deserve more. There are lots of ways to break down that argument, but I don't want to take up all of our time. So I just want to give a particular example of that, and that is from Anita Woolley, who is a professor at Carnegie Mellon, and who did a study where she had men and women sitting around a table trying to solve particular problems that had been set forward by her and by the other people who were doing this experiment. Turned out that the more women you had in the group, the better the group was at problem solving, up to 85%. Once you had 85%, it was fine to bring in the men. Now, what does that mean? It's not that the women were smarter than the men, it's that the women were more collaborative. They were more interested in confirming what they were saying or affirming what they were saying by talking to other people and saying, well, what about this idea or what about that? Whereas the men were individualistic and highly competitive against each other. And so once again, there's an example of the power of collaboration, not just so that you can win something, but so that you can understand something. So I want to leave it at that and invite your questions, in part because this is a way of making the idea of collaboration real. That is, if it's easier, and sometimes in my classes I find it is easier, to talk to your neighbor for 5 minutes as to what's the question that you want to ask, and that way you get a sense, that's actually a really good question, or don't ask that. So if you want to turn and talk to your neighbor and come up with a question, that's fine. If you want to just go right into Q&A, that's fine too. I let you lead.
And we do have a microphone if anyone feels like they need it to amplify their voice. I can bring it around.
Yes.
So, are these tests,
And can people hear?
sorry, are these tests SATs or LSATs predictors of anything?
Yeah, the car that your parents drive. It's true.
So then why, I mean, this place only lets in people with certain LSAT scores. So what's the point?
Give all the students a Mercedes. No, I don't mean to be irreverent, but I am. No, your question is serious. I was a professor. I was a lawyer doing voting rights work at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and when we were there, number one, we always collaborated with each other as well as with the clients, the people in the community, because they had a lot more knowledge about some of the issues in terms of the facts than we did. They may not have understood the law, but they understood the facts, and so it made a good interaction. But your question is more about the power of collaboration. And that's where, again, my experience as a lawyer, working with other lawyers who were committed to similar interventions, that was not only powerful, but it was affirming. And it was not only affirming, it was also doing pretty well. I mean, I can tell you, for example, I litigated a case with the former governor, Deval Patrick, and it was a case in Alabama. And for some odd reason, the other lawyers decided that I should take a car and drive it to Mobile, Alabama at night. Thank you. I was apparently delivering something. I cannot remember. I was in shock, right? Right, this is after Selma. This is after 1965, and the idea of me alone driving at night in Alabama from Selma to the coast. But I did it. And this is also before we had cell phones, so you were out there by yourself. But that was an aberration. Most of the time you were working with your colleagues, some of whom were, one of my colleagues was completely committed to alphabetizing the ballots that were the subject of the case. There was no reason to do that because we kept telling him, Deval and I kept telling him, he's now this person. I don't want to. He's a law professor too. But at the time, he just wanted to have something concrete and wanted them to be alphabetized. And we kept saying, the U.S. attorney, who, by the way, is now the senator from Alabama, and should explain to you why we were not thinking he was going to be very sympathetic. This is Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III. But our colleague who was male kept trying to reconvene the ballots to have them in a particular order, and then somebody from the U.S. Attorney's Office would just come and reorganize them. So it was, I think it may have been a way of feeling nervous on the part of some people, and this kept them busy so they weren't so nervous. It had no other usefulness. But we did win the case, and one of the reasons that we won the case is that we hired a social psychologist. And we hired a social psychologist. This is in part showing the importance of being able to work with other people, that even though you're, quote, the leader, you need to understand what other people are doing. And this social psychologist told us that we had to admit the black women who were potential jurors. And we were concerned because Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III would probably object, and so we'd get into this back and forth. But for some reason, we got 5 black women on the jury, and that made a big difference in terms of the outcome. But the other thing that made the biggest difference is that every day that case was in trial, the courtroom was full. And it was full of people who were concerned about the outcome. And that was the part that really gave people a sense they were in a community and that what they were doing and what they had been doing was just.
Was there a question over here?
So if you understand that things like the LSATs and SATs aren't indicative of people's performance, do you have ideas for perhaps other means of selection that would be or capture something like skills at collaboration?
Yeah, there are lots of, just to give you an example, Scott Page is a professor at the University of Michigan, and he does a lot of work in terms of group problem solving. And he suggests that, let's say you're giving a test, and you can get 10 scores, 1 through 10, in terms of your scores. And nobody gets all of the questions right. So how would you then pick the 2 people that you said you were going to use as, quote, the winners from that group? And it turns out that, at least according to Scott Page, that there was one person in the group who got 7 out of the 10 questions right, and there was somebody else in the group who got 3 of the questions right, 7 of them wrong, but the 3 they got right were the 3 that the other person had gotten wrong. So if you put those 2 people together, they complement each other, even though you could say one is, quote, smarter than the other because they got more questions right, and so therefore we should go with them, and then somebody else who got 6 out of the 10 questions right, but got wrong the same questions that the person with 7 had gotten wrong. So it's about bringing together people who have different things to offer and learning how to work well together. But again, going back to Anita Woolley, the more women that you have in these groups, at least at present, I'm not saying 10 years from now or 20 years from now that there'll be the same gender effect, but in the context of the present, having more women who are willing to talk to each other and to work together so that they come out with a common solution, I think is a very powerful intervention that doesn't answer the question about the LSAT per se, but it does suggest that our understanding of mission and our understanding of excellence needs to be a little bit reconsidered.
Hi. My question is about, actually it's first a comment, first of all a comment. You focus on how much comfortable the students may feel. You focus on the comfortable environment in the classroom or generally in the education. Comfortable, how we feel, how we feel in the environment.
Yes.
And so, and you focus on the presence that if we have more women in a team, they may feel more comfortable and they may reveal their potentials and they may be more productive. So it seems to me that you focus on a notion of how we feel the belonging of the people, how we feel, how we belong in a team. Is that?
Okay, are you using the term comfortable as sort of a psychological term that?
Both. I mean, it seems to me that you imply that how we feel in a team.
I see, okay.
It's something that will enable us to reveal our potentials. So if I am alone and I'm very, very different among 100 people, I may feel more isolated, and so I will not dare to speak up or say my opinion. While if I have some other people around me that make me feel more comfortable, I may be involved more in the debate and say my opinion.
Okay.
So I will use a very nice title of the book by Professor Tomiko Brown, takes courage to dissent. So if you have people around you that makes you feel comfortable, you have more courage to dissent. You have more courage to participate. So I try to see the notion of belonging and the notion of to feel comfortable to dissent, to feel comfortable to engage in the.
Okay,
And I see that you promote this with these studies that you mention. I don't know, I just get this idea, and I want
right.
you to tell me.
I think that's part of why the women do better than the men in Anita Woolley's study, is that they feel comfortable in that environment. Whereas if you had put them in a different environment in which they were competing with each other, they might have felt, and certainly from studies that I've seen and done about women in It's like I'm going to prison.
Yeah.
And so Anita Woolley's experiment, where the women outperformed the men, is an example of what you're describing. That is, the women felt very comfortable in that environment. They were willing to talk to each other and willing to admit, this is something that I would like to do, or I think we should do. Admit in the sense that it's novel. It's something that other people might not be aware of. Whereas what she found in terms of the men is that their role was to dominate, at least that, and to demonstrate that they were smarter than everyone else in order to be able to tell everyone else what to do, right? That's a different kind of hierarchy. So, I mean, just to make this very simple, it's the difference between a pyramid and an oval. And you can figure out which one is the pyramid and which one is the oval.
Okay. Thanks.
Go ahead.
So,
Do you need,
so it's a great, no, I don't think I can speak loudly, not loudly enough. So it's, I think we've all come to learn that collaboration is critical for success, for men and women. It's critical for learning because it engages one in the learning process. It's critical for problem solving. It's critical to succeed in the outside world, not just in law school. So I have two questions. One is, because once students graduate, they're back in that very competitive meritocracy again. So do we need to think about including grading for your ability to collaborate? And how do we go about taking this notion that collaboration should be something more highly valued after law school? I mean, it is, but to get your job, you're not getting it because you got a good grade for collaborating. You got it because you were a standout law student, right? So how do we blend the two? So I'm thinking not about how do you get into universities, but how do you take whatever momentum is built around the collaboration model back out after graduation?
no, so it's a great question, and I think the Posse Foundation is a good example of at least one answer to your question, because the Posse Foundation, they admit people as a group. And the idea is not that if we bring this group together, they're going to be the smartest group. The idea of bringing the group together is that they're going to reinforce each other and identify what each person's strength really is and encourage them to do that. And the posse is not just limited to the people you know on campus, but when you graduate, this is still a group of people that you can contact and brainstorm with, and they play, it's like a family, and they play that role of reinforcing, of encouraging, but also of being brutally honest when it's appropriate.
So this is a nice dovetail with the question that I had. I really appreciated your presentation. My question is about collaboration in the classroom and how that interfaces with concerns about academic honesty and concerns that people have about plagiarism and collaboration in that context. I'm wondering if you have any ideas for, I mean, I guess to some degree my context is coming from teaching legal writing here, where, there's, you can collaborate, but it's with, an asterisk. And I'm wondering how in the classroom we can work past these things, and also how we can teach students about how to collaborate within the kind of policy environment we're in. Well,
One of the things I do, which may be something I shouldn't be sharing, get me in trouble, but I allow students in my Law and the Political Process class to take the exam in groups of up to 4. Okay? Now you might say, well, that's cheating. I say, no, that's the way, if I were getting ready for a case, I wouldn't say, well, excuse me, but I have to do this case. Don't look over my shoulder because you'll be noticing what I'm doing. So that's, that answers your question? Or, I mean, what I'm saying is, going back to Posse, that this is a group of people who are not only fraternal or connected while they're in college, but then they graduate, and you're still part of that, quote, posse otherwise known in some instances as family. And those people know you well, they know what your strengths are, your weaknesses, but they're also your friend. And so they can give you feedback or encouragement that is extremely worthwhile when you're just graduating and there are multiple options or very different options, and there's something wrong with both or all of the three options that you have. It's really helpful to have somebody else who knows you say, well, frankly, given what you'd be doing in option 2, I'd recommend that you do that, as opposed to relying on the people who are interviewing you, who don't really know how you would function in stressful situations, or in situations where somebody is bereaved, or in situations where somebody is a little bit too full of themselves, and it may feel awkward, right, to say that. But on the other hand, if you've developed a relationship of friendship and of partnership, then saying something can be, even if it's somewhat harsh, it can be really, really important long term. Oh, yes.
I'll also mention that the Coop is here selling copies of Professor Guinier's book. If you could raise your hand, so you can buy your own copy there.
Hi. I just had a question related to what she was asking, because I thought one of the things I was excited about law school was, like, I knew that there was a really high kind of prevalence of study groups, and I thought that that would in some ways replicate kind of the collaborative learning you're speaking about, which I had always enjoyed doing. But I don't know that students were able to kind of see who was complementary to them in the way you were talking about, and it really just became a race to be in a study group with the people who were seen as smartest in that very meritocratic way. So I was wondering if when your students take exams together, like, do you facilitate maybe who they should group up with, or do they just kind of group up naturally? And have you seen any issues with kind of maybe people who aren't as comfortable kind of speaking up in that very traditional way and being marked as like one of the gunners, being left out of that system?
Well, I don't construct the groups for the students. They construct them for themselves. So I don't really know what any particular student's personality is outside of the classroom, or how, to what extent are people friendly as opposed to dominating. I should make it very clear, although I allow students to work as a group, they submit one exam, but each of them takes one portion of the exam and gets, quote, more credit for it, right? So it's not as if you can just give it to somebody who's really smart and say, pay them, or, to do it on your behalf. It's another form of learning, because there are certain parts of the exam where certain students have really aced that question, and it's just wonderful if they're in a position to explain it. This is like Eric Mazur's physics. Explain it to the person sitting next to you. It reinforces your own confidence, as well as enables them to better understand what's at stake, or what the question really wants you to talk about or think about.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Just going back to the Posse Foundation for a second, I was wondering about your opinion of the organization's sort of mission. So it takes high-achieving students and puts them in elite schools mostly, and I was wondering if you think it's the organization's responsibility to not just empower those students to succeed in those spaces, but also to dismantle or challenge the systemic racism and privilege that exists there.
I don't think the Posse program has enough money or people working with them to solve all the problems that you've put on the table. In terms of them they're creating a posse. They're not preparing people to do better in English than in math, right? So they're taking a group of people where, at least as I understand it, somebody is really good in math, somebody is really good in English. And so it's not that they're going to be competing against each other. It's that when other members of the posse want to take a class in English, they may want to ask the person who knows that well, which of the courses should I take? And, oh, I'm stuck in this particular course, can you help me understand? So it's really an ongoing relationship of partnership as opposed to competitive individualism.
Thank you again for your talk. I'm crashing the party a little bit from the ed school. I was a middle school teacher for a long time in a pretty low socioeconomic school with fabulous kids. I would love for all of my students to end up in a space like this, going to school here, but it's very frustrating for public school teachers sometimes. There's such a disconnect between messages that we get that what students need at the law school or students need to be successful professionals are extra cognitive things like collaboration, being able to work in groups, being able to problem solve. But what our educational system pushes us to do as educators runs exactly contrary to that. So it's a little bit difficult to reconcile things that people want inside the classroom. People want to see group learning and collaboration, but the pressures that we get is to produce results on tests that don't measure those things, don't value those things. And it's a little bit hard to, I feel like I know what I want my students to learn and how I want to do right by them, but it's swimming upstream, you know. So I wish that there was a little bit more communication from the professional schools and the universities on if these are the skills and values that you want, you have to pay a little bit more attention to the K through 12 so that we can produce students that are going to be successful in those arenas. I just don't know how to do that, you know, from the ground level.
Well, first of all, don't take it on yourself, right? I mean, this is an opportunity for you to identify other people who are concerned as well. In the context of the ed school, I've had a range of experiences, and there are some professors who do collaborate in terms of preparing students for whatever that course is aimed to teach. I agree with you that it's difficult to bring this concept to K through 12, but I don't think it's impossible. And in fact, I've noticed more references to team learning or group learning for K through 12. I mean, not kindergartners per se, but certainly by third or fourth grade, having students work together and then explain to the class what it is that they just accomplished. And at least in some cases, that is very affirming to students who would otherwise be very shy. Mm-hmm. And it's affirming because somebody has their back. And somebody also has worked with them and has confidence in them. So, I mean, I think in some ways it's change by walking backwards. Meaning, if you can change the way in which we are educating in high school or in college or in law school, then that can become a precursor and a sort of a timely intervention for the K through 12 community to start rethinking. What is it that we're training people to do? Are we training people to do really well on some test that is for a large portion of the citizens because of their gender, because of their the responsibilities they have at home, because of the lack of money in their homes, that they don't have the same chance to compete and to hire. I don't know if any of you have seen the book Crazy You by Andrew Ferguson. He describes this, his experience getting his son into college. And he talks about the U.S. News and World Report and how he went down to Washington to find out what the U.S. News and World Report was doing, and he had a really hard time finding the U.S. News and World Report because there was one person. One person in this huge building who's sitting there saying, okay, Harvard is above Yale and Yale is above Columbia. I don't know why nobody has outed him, right? But it just shows you that there's this competitive, individualistic culture that I think would benefit from a more collaborative and interactive approach. And I think the men would benefit just like the women. And in fact, going back to my experience at Penn, although it was the course was started by women, a number of men started, coming to take the course because it was fun and because they were learning from their peers, and in that process, developing confidence in their own ability to participate and to educate.
So I agree with you that standardized tests, whether SATs, LSATs, or even GREs, are problematic for different students. But I'm coming from the higher ed administration program at that school. We receive higher ed program at that school. We receive thousands and thousands of applications from students wanting to get in. I wonder if you've thought about alternatives to any standardized testing.
Well, I think the POSSE program is a really interesting idea. I think the 10% plan at University of Texas is an interesting idea. In both cases, it's a way of identifying people who work well together or who are really driven. And it would be nice to see the students who get in through the 10% in Texas, at least the University of Texas, work with the students who are in the POSSE Foundation, or who have been cajoled and encouraged through the POSSE Foundation. Because those two groups, they each have a strength. They may not be perfect, but to do very well in high school, you have to work pretty hard. To do very well in college, you have to be able to work with other people, not just with yourself. And I think POSSE and the 10% plan represent at least ideas in that direction. And I think there are lots of ways to even do this with kids in nursery school and in kindergarten, getting them starting early with the ability to work with a peer and not thinking that this is all about competitive individualism and that's it. Yes, you need to, well, you need Professor Nick.
So I wanted to ask about the filtering into higher educational institutions in the first place, and in particular the choice of students about what schools to apply to and where to attend. Because it's interesting that you mentioned the 10% program. I just went to a very discouraging talk not too long ago about the 10% program and whether it improves racial diversity, which is one of its objectives, and actually also class diversity. And the conclusion was essentially not, that it's been quite unsuccessful in reaching that goal. And the biggest reason is that most of the kids admitted under the program who are not at the schools that were already overrepresented at UT, most of them are not choosing to go to UT Austin. So the 10% program gives them a choice of any school in the state. Some are not choosing to go to college at all. The vast majority are not choosing to go to Austin. A lot are not also going to A&M, so those are sort of like the two flagship schools. So they go to more local campuses. And likewise, there's a study out of Stanford about what kinds of schools people who have the test scores that could get them into selective colleges. If you come in, if you're in the bottom income quartile, most people who have those kinds of qualifying numbers nonetheless apply only to completely non-selective educational institutions. And some of that, of course, is socioeconomic, like in the sense that they want to live at home and they're going to whatever school is local. So then you can understand that. But I think a lot of it is a sense of not belonging, right? A sense of discomfort at the time that you are, like, you don't think of this as a place where you belong, even if your test scores tell you that by the criteria of whoever's deciding that you belong, that you would belong.
That's where I think the Posse program has a lot to offer, which is to create a group of people from your neighborhood or from an area that is close to or reflective of your own experiences. And that's a group of people who are introduced to each other before they get to college. So the threat or the fear of going to those schools in Texas are really big. Mm-hmm. And you can easily get lost, in a school that has 40,000 people, and you're one of the 40,000, right? And so having, in some ways, it's an extension of the 10% plan, but it's an extension where the goal is not just to see how well did you do in high school, but how well are you in working with this person or that kind of person, and what is your team trying to realize, to appreciate, to reinforce each other, so that it's not competitive individualism. It's really a much more collaborative, problem-solving approach to the future, which can be, which is a pathway that can be followed in multiple and different roadways or pathways. Yes.
So I was wondering if you could talk about why you think there's been what seems to be a resistance to the collaborative method, especially in law school. I think there's, still seems to be a strong conviction among many faculty that the Socratic method really is the best way to have students learn, and where you think that comes from in your opinion, and why the resistance.
Well, you have hit one of my weak spots here. Weak spots in that I know too much about about the question, and it's a really important question. So I didn't know this until I came to Harvard, and maybe 5 years ago, and the person who told me about this told me not to tell anybody who he was. So it was a male, but that's all I can tell you. Because he was an anthropologist who had been writing about law school and the origin story, et cetera. And what's the origin story? That apparently Christopher Columbus Langdell wanted people to buy his lesson plans, and so he took the students, the male students who graduated from Harvard, gave them copies of his lesson plans, and then sent them around the country to do plays of the Socratic method. And it seemed, really engaging. And remember, this is before television. It's before you had computers. So this seemed, it was like the Fuller Brush Man in the 1950s, and they knock on the door and they'd say, oh, we have something that's going to really help you, housewife, because the people who would answer at that time were all women. The problem I have with the Socratic method is, number one, women do not do as well as men under the Socratic method, and yet they do very well if you just give them a chance to talk to the person next to you, or two people next to you, play out your ideas, and then you feel confident and say, well, our group, so if it's wrong, it's not just you who's wrong, but these two other or three other people, so you have more confidence. This goes to a book called The Female Brain. I don't know, I'm not a person who knows about brains or medical issues, but what she says is that for women to process an idea, it goes through 3 different parts of your brain before you feel comfortable saying it. For a man, it goes right to your mouth. So, I mean, it's called the female brain. You can go and look it up and see if, but she may be, the person who wrote that may be exaggerating, but I think there is something to it, that because of hormones or, different biological, or because of biological differences, that it may be that men are quicker on their feet than women. But that doesn't mean that they're smarter on their feet. It just means that whatever is coming out of their mouth comes out quickly, as opposed to the women, thinking it through, saying, well, that's not the right answer. So at the same time, if you think of speaking up and being firm and competitive, and that's the best way to be a lawyer, I don't think that most lawyers act that way, and if they do, I don't think that they have many clients. And certainly, if you are doing public interest, you do not, if you go around being, the mother of the earth, right? And everybody comes to you, and you only, the only person who knows the answer, and everybody else is stupid and you're smart. Well, people aren't going to come to see you. And let me just give you another example. John Coates, who's a colleague, gave a talk about what's happening at corporate law firms. And he said that currently, and this was like 4 or 5 years ago, and it still seems real to me. So he said that right now, or right then, 4 or 5 years ago, what these law firms had was a pyramid. And you'd bring in graduates of Harvard, Yale, Penn, whatever, and they'd get jobs at the bottom of the pyramid, and then they'd work their way up to the top. He said, well, the pyramid is going to become a diamond, because the students, the graduates of law school, who used to be the source of the triangle, are being outsourced, because you have people now in India who speak English, who have gone to law school, and who charge a whole lot less than whatever it costs to pay for first-year graduates out of law school. So that at the bottom, which is now the triangle, that's going to be a diamond, so there's not going to be very many people. In the middle is where the women are going to be working, because they are going to work from 9 in the morning to 5 or 6 at night, so they can be with their family. And then at the very top, right, is of the diamond, that's where you have the power. And most of those people will be men. Some of them may be women. There are certainly many more women who are assuming positions of power. But the real question is, at least for me, is that the kind of power that we want, to have it in some way trained and focused on a very small group of people who are very proud of themselves, but are not necessarily in a position to understand and to intervene appropriately in cases where the issue involves the facts or the law. And especially given my experience at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, working with somebody else is so much more affirming, and especially if you're in, as I was, somewhat threatening or dangerous territory. I mean, I remember litigating a case in Arkansas, and the 3 of us, there was a white female, a black male, and me. And we would go to Mississippi from Arkansas to have dinner, and the people in that restaurant, they didn't know what to do. They say they're from New York. Like, thank God they're not coming and moving in.
One more question?
And also, don't hesitate to come and knock on my door and after you read the book. But you don't even have to read it. You can just browse through it. You may have suggestions for a next book. So thank you, guys.
I think, we finished?
Oh, did you have a question?
I had a question or a comment that I hoped you might, it has to do with the density of the meritocracy. That is, the numbers and the distribution, that some people are in and some people are out. And it's from a sociological point of view, is that something that needs to be changed? As
What do you mean by
need,
some
I mean,
people
it
are
seems
in
as
or
if the
out?
people, large numbers of people are just being kind of dunned into submission and by the society's leadership, the media. And then you have people who are the leaders, the supposed meritocracy, that actually does talk to each other. Do you see it that way, or do you have any comment on that observation? Or
Well, why don't
is
we
it a
talk
problem?
a little bit?
Sorry.
Because I'm not sure I understand what the question is, so it's hard to give an answer.
Well, the question is that the way it is?
Is what the way it is?
The meritocracy, the ruling class, is shrinking, and the non-ruling class is, and the non-influential class that is not really involved in a dialogue with the societal democratic decision-making process is deteriorating in quality, and is sort of people have fewer and fewer choices. Both
Okay,
the
so
Democrats and
Are you saying that the people at the top are, there are fewer of them, but they're more powerful?
yes, that's what I'm suggesting. Whether you think that's true or not.
I'd have to do a little more research. Off the top of my head, I have no idea how many of those people are billionaires, and I also don't know what they're doing with their money other than making more money. I mean, some of them may be contributing right to the public in a way that's useful. But when you think that corporations are now persons, according to the Supreme Court, and you have huge differences between those who are in the top 1% or 10% and those who are the quote working class, just huge distinctions. And there's a very interesting study where they showed a difference between the way people in Sweden think about the allocation of power or money and the way people in the United States think about it. If you give them a circle to fill out, it's pretty fair-minded. But if you give them the original or the current view of what's happening in terms of the distribution of power, and it's in that same format. I think there were 6,000 people who participated in this study, and I'd say less than 20% were in favor of the current distribution. They were much more interested in what's happening in Sweden than what's happening in Ohio. But they didn't know, which was which. And so I think they want to think that there's room at the top. And so that's, in some ways, while they'll justify or not complain about people hoarding at the top. But at the same time, they want to have enough money, I'm talking about working class people, so that they can pay their bills. They would like to send their kids to college too, but the distribution of funds doesn't really allow that, and nobody is talking about that, because we've now decided corporations are persons, and so if the corporation is making billions of dollars, good for them. So, I mean, I do think that what you're asking for is a very profound culture shift, that would then lead to a power shift, that would then lead to a good answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Guinier. On behalf of the library, I would like to thank you very much for writing this book and for this very interesting conversation today. And thank you all for coming. And I hope you come to the rest of our series this spring. The next one, book talk we have is on, it's on March 11th with Professor Glenn Cohen, and we have flyers here for you for the rest of our series. And I also want to emphasize again, thank you to the Coop for coming and selling copies of The Tyranny of the Meritocracy for us here today. And if you can't get a copy today, I'm sure that the Coop will still have copies available next door if you want to come back later this week.
And don't hesitate about coming to my office hours.